Okay, thank you. So, as I was just introduced, I'm Tim Erickson. For those who are listening remotely, we have a small but dedicated audience today, which is good. Just a couple of my sort of standard introductory slide, a few things about me. I was originally co-founder of Drupal. I'm one of the only founders that's still with Drupal, or I'm the only. We're a very small shop. David works with me when we have work for him to do. Other trivial facts, I do juggling. I'm a bike commuter, and an active member of the Backdrop CMS community, which for this particular session is sort of the heart of things. A few sort of background things about my own path to getting involved in Backdrop is that prior to working with Drupal, I spent a lot of time working in online civic engagement with a group called edemocracy.org. I was involved in a national group called the Deliberative Democracy Consortium, and very involved in online civic engagement. And you know, for me, this was, in fact, I was a part-time stay-at-home dad at the time, and this was less of a job and more of a social engagement thing for me. When I came to Drupal, one, because I was looking for a more financially rewarding path than online civic engagement. But I also came to Drupal very specifically because I was intrigued by this notion of open source and like how it worked. I was using open source tools at the time. In online civic engagement, I was a consumer of a lot of open source tools, but I wasn't really an active member. And in fact, the group I was with, was working, we heavily used a very small unknown tool called Group Server, which was kind of a group management tool, combination with server and an online web board that was being released as open source and trying to build a community. So I was doing research on this whole idea of open source, the idea that you could build these kind of complicated CMSs and software projects with an open source model it seemed utopian to me. It's like that, you know, how does that work? And so as I went out into sort of web development, I was drawn to Drupal. You know, people say come for the code, stay for the community. Well, I had heard about this Drupal community and really came for that, and did sort of fall in love with Drupal as well at the same time. I mean, Drupal did serve my needs, and I had experimented with other tools. But I came to Drupal really looking for that open source experience and to learn from it. So, and the other thing I was trying to remember there was, I think also that I wanted to be a part of a bigger project, right? So I didn't just want to build websites. It's like one of the fun things about being involved in Drupal, from my perspective, is that in the community is you're not just using Drupal to earn a living, but you're helping contribute to something bigger that's being used by nonprofits and small businesses, you know, around the world to hopefully make things better, although not always. I think as I got involved in Backdrop, I approached it with similar interests, and I think one of the allures of Backdrop, in addition, you know, beyond the technical ones, was the fact that it was a smaller community, and that the opportunity to sort of learn about open source I think in a smaller community, it felt like to me like it would be a more meaningful experience, because in the Drupal world, I was beginning to feel like a small cog in a really big machine, right? Like I could have an impact, but I was just one tiny piece in this really big thing. And Backdrop was very alluring because it didn't feel so big. It felt like I would be stepping into a smaller community where I would have a better sense of what's going on. When I set out to do this session, and when I proposed this sessions, my goals were, a selfish goal was just to help provide me an excuse to process what it was I was learning, to think about that. I have a long-term vision. of going back. It's been almost 10 years since I did the online civic engagement stuff, but at some point I'd like to do a talk at a online civic engagement conference saying what I learned from open source that might apply towards the broader process of civic engagement. And I'm still not quite sure what it is I would say at that talk, but I think there have been some lessons that I've learned. I also view this is the first time I've given this talk, as will be apparent, and my goal is to sort of refine this and maybe do it again, maybe do a little bit of writing on it as well, which might be a better sort of channel to write about this, because I think at any given Drupal camp I'm not likely to get a critical enough mass, whereas a blog post would reach a bigger audience. And also just to share some of my experiences that I think are also meaningful of what I'm experiencing in the backdrop community. I think they're meaningful to people in the Drupal community as well, and there may be lessons to learn in the Drupal community. To be frank, as once I sort of dug into the topic, it wasn't so much that I learned a lot of really new things in backdrop, but that things became much clearer to me in that smaller, more intimate setting. Things I had probably already learned in Drupal, but just weren't quite as crystallized. It's then when you get into a smaller fishbowl, everything became bigger. And also I was playing a much bigger role in backdrop, so that amplified what I was learning. And so much of what I would talk about probably is completely not specific to backdrop, but just something that my experience in backdrop reinforced for me. I have a blank slide. This is I think this is DrupalCon Vienna, and it's the contribution room. I got involved in contributing to DrupalCorn like right out of the bat at my very first Drupal camp. Partly because I came for that, but also because I had very persuasive friends who encouraged me to come to the sprint and began mentoring me right away. When I went to my first DrupalCon Austin, I was volunteered to be a mentor already at my very first DrupalCon on sprint day. And I walked into a room like this, and this was, I think, my first really big lesson about how open source gets made. Sort of to walk into a room with 300 or 400 developers sitting around tables. Most of them were there on their own dime or free time, volunteering to help make Drupal. And that really kind of blew me away. You will not see a room that big for backdrop, but maybe someday. Some of the things that I am, the other things that drew me, so for the record, the people in the audience are familiar with backdrop, so I'm not going to talk about why backdrop came to be today. That's another session. Or what backdrop is. But I'll mention a few things about the community that have struck me, and also some of which have led me towards backdrop. One of the reasons that backdrop came to be was a perception amongst the founders of backdrop and others in the community that with Drupal 8 there was a potential that backdrop was going to leave a part of the audience behind for Drupal 7. And well, my purpose today is not to to criticize or critique Drupal. I will say I think that it's true. It is happening. I'm seeing it all the time that people are coming to me either as developers who just don't have the need or the desire to sort of go the Drupal 8 route, or from organizations that just don't have the technical need for all that Drupal 8 has to offer, and they're just reevaluating and saying, you know what, we just need something simpler, and we're not interested in Drupal 8. And it's not a bad thing, but it's just not for us. And they're moving to WordPress and other things, and the backdrop community is trying to capture them. I think that there was because of that sort of division, the backdrop community worked really hard, or recognized a need right up front to define who it is we're trying to serve, what is our mission. I think at the time they believed that the Drupal community didn't have a real clear focus on who they were trying to serve, and that part of the problem was trying to serve everybody and be all things to everyone. And I think part of the philosophy of backdrop is we can't do that. We need to pick who it is we're trying to serve, focus on them. The backdrop webpage has, under their About section, a mission, audience, and principles. I think I haven't went back recently and looked, but I think you might see something a little bit, I don't know if there's a mission statement for Drupal. I think maybe there is now if there wasn't before, but I think it's a lot more ambiguous. The Drupal, well, the mission statement for Backdrop is still a little bit general. Backdrop CMS enables people to build highly customized websites affordably through collaboration and open source software. I don't know if it's the mission statement itself that really starts to define what Backdrop is, but if you jump into their principles, it starts to get a lot more clear. So Backdrop defined these 7 principles right up front: easier updates, backwards compatibility, simplicity, focus, extensibility, great performance, release on time, freedom. So the one that I would highlight here is the focus. Simplicity and focus. Write code for the majority, include features for the majority. Backdrop has this sort of principle that to get into core, a new feature should benefit about 80% of its users. And as a very active member of the community, I could say this comes up all the time, right? Whenever you propose something, the very first question is, does it meet our 80% use case? It's not that if it doesn't, it's not worthwhile, but then maybe it's something that should go into contrib or something else. Now, the 80% use case, there is no objective way for us right now to determine that, so it's kind of, we make a subjective decision, what we think 80%. There is an ongoing discussion about how we can better measure that and get feedback from the community, so we are more accurately reflecting what 80% of our users do actually need. But at this stage, it's kind of a gut feeling, right? And that doesn't always work because, you know, if I really want a feature, I assume that 80% of the other people do as well. Whereas, you know, if I don't, then I assume that I'm in the 80% that don't need that feature. But if a couple of us go back and forth and we talk a little bit about it, I think we usually can come to kind of an agreement about, okay, maybe mine isn't the really common use case. So I think, you know, if there's a lesson from this stuff, it's basically the importance of knowing what your mission is, who your audience is, and I'm still not sure Drupal knows that. I think Drupal is still trying to be everything to everybody, and I don't know if that's wrong, but I know that I feel better working in a community that has that defined purpose. So part of this particular session is going to be me just sort of some random things that strike me as being sort of important about being involved in Backdrop. And we'll just sort of go through them. And I was going to add a slide, and I didn't. That's probably what the blank slide was going to be. That quickly talked about what I am doing in Backdrop, or sort of how involved I've gotten. I started out. First of all, when Backdrop was first announced, and that's been about, I think, 6 years ago, since it was like announced. It's been that long, it seems hard to believe. I remember being intrigued by the idea right away. First of all, I had gotten involved in Drupal 8 core development immediately and recognized a lot of the obstacles that were coming for people like myself and other people. I wasn't too worried about them at the time, but I saw them. And when Jen Lampton and Nate Hauge, now Nate Lampton, announced Backdrop, I was excited partly for the kind of reasons I mentioned before, which was I was already feeling like a small cog in a big machine, and I loved the idea of a fork if for no other reason than here was a smaller opportunity of a smaller community that I could get involved in and feel like I would have a much more meaningful impact. I did not, unfortunately, get involved right off the bat. I followed Backdrop for several years before I actually, and I would frequently run into Jen and Nate at Drupal camps and cons and get updates from them. I would peek into the issue queue from time to time, but I probably didn't even spin up my first Backdrop site until, 2 or 3 years later. And it wasn't until about a year and a half ago that I really started to delve in deep. I started to attend I spun up some Backdrop sites. I started to occasionally attend their weekly meetings. Google Hangouts at the time. They have at least 2 meetings every week that are live and anyone can join. I joined the Gitter channel, which is the equivalent of Slack for Backdrop. Began asking questions and sort of slowly got more involved and began to volunteer to do things. And now, you know, I pretty much try to be on their meetings every week and am in regular communication. I feel like I'm part of the sort of the inner circle in terms of people that are involved on a day-to-day basis. The importance of taking initiative is something that I had already learned in Backdrop, or in Drupal, but certainly learned in Backdrop. And this is just, I think, a lesson true of any open source community, right? If you see something that needs to be done, sometimes you just have to jump in and do it, or ask questions about it. When I first got involved in Backdrop, I found myself all the time saying, would it be okay if I did X? And people were getting really tired of that. They'd say, quit asking us, just do it. You don't need our permission.
It's a lesson I've learned too.
So,
it's a hard one.
That's still a hard lesson for me. I still like to ask permission, and I mean, I think that you certainly can take that too far, right? You can just get pushy, and that's not good either. But sort of my approach has come to be, like, if I see something that needs to be doing, rather than asking, should I do it, is to just sort of start working on it and say, hey, I saw this thing that needed to be done. I'm working on it. This is what I'm doing. Let me know if you have any concerns, right? So to be open to sort of feedback, but not to sort of wait for permission. And this is true in the issue queue, but it's also true in terms of community matters. Open source projects are desperate really for people with organizing skills, design skills, other skills, especially a project like Backdrop. I think part of the success of Drupal has been that there are a lot of those people in the community, right, that aren't just programmers. I think if you were to compare and contrast the Drupal community to a lot of smaller other open source projects, that one of the big differences is that Drupal attracted people that were organizers and that had skills like mine, community engagement, and that the Drupal community did a better job at doing things like outreach and mentorship and things like that. They haven't done the best job. I mean, in some ways, Backdrop is learning from them. I mean, so much of the Drupal community and the Drupal code has been inherited by Backdrop, but there are also some things, hopefully, maybe that they're trying to do differently and can be learned backwards. But there's a lot of room certainly in the Backdrop community, and my experience was this was true in Drupal as well, that if you're not like a coder and you want to contribute, the opportunities are there. Part of the trick is just taking initiative, and I think too many people that aren't coders feel a little bit like second-class citizens and are afraid to do things, when in fact if they just sort of stepped up and did them, it would be welcomed and embraced. Sort of another random thing, and this is something, I mean, I presented on this before I ever started doing Backdrop in Drupal, but it's become so much more apparent to me in Backdrop because it's the importance of documentation. And when I say documentation, I mean documentation of all times. I did a presentation on documentation in Drupal a few years back where I stressed just writing blog posts, asking questions in forums. These are all forms of documentation. If I think about my own Drupal experience, one of the reasons Drupal was so valuable to me as a tool was that it's so rare that I can come up with a question that I can't Google it and find somebody's already asked that question and there's an answer for me. And that's not true with all tools. But there have been so many people ahead of me asking questions, answering questions, writing blog posts, that it's just rare. I mean, unless it's like an obscure question about a particular module in a particular configuration, that I might not find an answer. But in Backdrop, that's not the case, right? Because Backdrop is, I mean, I'm trying to make it the case, but it hasn't been the case just because it's a newer project, it's a smaller audience, and also I think the newer, like the Drupal 8 lifestyle, Backdrop or the Drupal 8 sort of development cycle, Backdrop is also introducing new features on a regular basis, which means there are features that are only 6 months old, and they still need to be documented in this way, and people still need to experiment with them and document them. My comment about the dangers of Slack and Gitter is this is, I think, a problem for both Drupal and Backdrop, is that as a community we're moving more to using chat tools to communicate, and chat tools don't produce that kind of documentation in the way that we were, Stack Exchange and Drupal.org, or the forums at Drupal.org did, 10 years ago, or even 8 years ago. I have been heavily pushing people, one of the roles I play in trying to reinforce this in Backdrop is just like when people bring things up, is encourage people to do things like this. Jeff here, a very active member of the project management committee for Backdrop. In this case, he asked a question: how does one create a node programmatically in the Backdrop form? And then he went ahead and answered it. And this was his way of documenting that. And it's a lot easier. I mean, we do have official documentation that's much more formal, and that would be a really great, to go into that documentation and sort of add this. But that is more intimidating. It requires a little more thought, and not everybody can do that. Not everybody has access to sort of update the general documentation, but anybody can go to the forum and just say, here's a problem I had, here's how I solved it. It's a little bit curious that his photo is different in those two posts because he posted them 5 minutes apart. So basically he just deliberately went, asked the question, and answered it. I've done this a few times, and oftentimes when people come to the Slack channel and they ask a question, my frustration is that, hey, that's a really good question. I don't want to waste my time answering it in Slack because nobody will ever find it there. Let's get that into the forum. And sometimes I encourage people to just do that themselves, or I don't have a screenshot of it. Recently I just sometimes will take and copy their question out of Slack or Gitter, post it in the forum, and then I will answer it there for them. But things like that. The other thing I've started to do is I remember Shane Thomas is here. Does anybody know Shane Thomas? The Code Karate guy. He used to make these module a day videos where he has over 200 videos out on various Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 modules. I think 150 videos on Drupal 7 modules, he told me. And that was a huge resource for me as beginning in Drupal. It's like I would Google a module and I'll find it. Shane had made a video for it and be able to watch that. We don't have that in Backdrop, and it's just an opportunity for me to jump in and start making some videos. So that's when I've got 4. I told Shane I only got 196 to catch up with him. But I've been trying to make videos to just make it easier for newcomers. The importance of providing easy access for volunteers with diverse skills. I talked a little bit about this already, the importance, the need for people that do things other than code. We need more code contributors as well, but I think one of the things, the biggest lessons that have come for me out of the Drupal community was I think Drupal has done a really good job. It's had some really talented people in mentoring new contributors. If you go to any DrupalCon, they have the big contribution sprints and they have the mentored sprints. And I think they've done a really good job at promoting that and developing a cadre of people who are just committed to helping newcomers contribute back to Drupal. That's how I got involved. I got sucked into Drupal by Jess, I forget her last name, XJM on Drupal. She was at one of my very first Drupal camp and was just an excellent mentor and an excellent salesperson for the idea of contribution. And really sold me on the fact that 1, I had something to offer, and then 2, helped me get started doing it. I think one of the things that Backdrop hasn't really gotten to, I've been also trying to work a bit on we just don't quite have the size of a community yet to have like a really active mentorship. I think most of the people involved in Backdrop are by nature good mentors. So, well, it's not an official mentorship program. I think anybody, I had some mostly positive experiences in the Drupal community. I had a few negative ones. And I think partly that was the fact of the large community, that it's just not always going to be positive. I think in Backdrop right now, partly because it's so small and just because the people involved in it are so committed to welcoming new people, that you're much less likely to have a negative experience if you try to contribute, even if you get some things wrong. Not that it never happens, but one of the things that Backdrop is doing that helped me get involved was these weekly meetings. Every week they have a weekly developer meeting where they basically just talk about, these are the priorities we're working on in DrupalCorn. These are sort of the active issues, what their status is and what needs to be done. And anybody can jump in on that call and like find out what the priorities are, or add something to the list, like this is important to me. And like I had experiences when I first got involved in Backdrop where I would drop in on a meeting like this and say, hey, I'm struggling with this particular bug. And 3 hours later, somebody would write a patch for it. Now, I found that people are and continue to be, including myself, much more responsive to newcomers because we're trying to be so welcome. And the longer I'm around, the less maybe prompt my responses I get are. Because people are focusing on the other newcomers, and because they assume I now have more skills to solve my own problems, so they don't have to be quite as assertive. But that's not to say that I still don't get. I feel like it's still just a much more responsive community, and I think again part of that is just that it's a small community and sort of everybody knows each other, so it's really easy to get people's attention. If something is really bothering me about Backdrop, I feel like I have the ability to like get this fixed and get it into core, just because I can talk to people I know who to talk to. If I write a patch, I can, ping the one or two core. We only have a couple of core committers. I can ping them and get them to look at my work, and that's just not as easy in Drupal. Although I think it's possible in Drupal as well, if you really invest the time into getting to know the DrupalCorn developer community. I was always a little bit surprised when I would talk to people that had been involved in Drupal longer than me and would say that they found the core developers to be like a very exclusive group and hard to get into, and that wasn't my experience at all. I was meeting core developers at my first Drupal camp, and they were like mentoring me and helping me. And I think sometimes that there's a wall there, but it's a little bit artificial. Like it's a little bit, or self-imposed. It's a little bit, people perceive core to be intimidating and are a little bit afraid to get in and ask questions. And I actually found that if you sort of take that initiative in Drupal and get involved in core and get to know people, that you can get things done. Being patient and being persistent. This is an obvious, the being patient part I think is obvious to anybody who's like worked in the Drupal issue queue, that things don't necessarily happen very quick and fast. In fact, they almost never do. And you'll often hear people talk about writing a patch 2 years ago that sat there and never got reviewed. And I understood that as a member of the Drupal community, that it is a bunch of volunteers, and you just can't expect things to get acted on right away. And despite my saying that I can get things done faster in Backdrop, being involved in Backdrop has just really reinforced, though. I mean, it's because I know everybody and I can watch some of these issues from beginning to end. I realize that even an issue that has the attention of core developers who are committed to working on it can still take several months with what seems to be very little progress, but it's just because when you've got a bunch of volunteers that are trying to work on a complicated problem, sometimes it takes 2 weeks before the person you need really has the time to respond. And that isn't anybody being neglectful. It isn't that they're not interested. It's just that, I need Lerlin to look at this problem, and Lerlin is a volunteer and he's just busy right now. So that sort of understand, I just feel like I comprehend the speed at which things can happen. Now, I still think they should be able to happen faster than they do in Drupal. I think right now, I feel like, especially from my own involvement, that the rate of that things happen, or certainly can happen in Backdrop is greater. But that is partially just that it's a very small community, and I don't know if that's sustainable. I mean, if Backdrop continued to do everything that it is now and scale to the size of Drupal, I think we'd be fighting the same kinds of problems that Drupal is. The persistent thing is something else I learned in Drupal, but has been reinforced in Backdrop, which is that it's not that uncommon, especially for newcomers, to submit a patch or a question and then wait and wait and wait, and then 2 years later complain that nobody responded to them. And what I do in the Backdrop community is I might submit a bug report and wait for a week, and then I might bring it up in Gitter and say, has anybody looked at, is anybody else having this problem? I try not to be a pest, but I try to be persistent. And that's where like these meetings come in, is that, if something is really bothering you, you've submitted even just a bug report, or you've submitted a patch, and it needs to be reviewed, there are these weekly meetings that you can come to and just say, hey, I'd really like somebody to look at this, or I'd like to solve this myself, but I'm not sure how. Somebody tell me how I might help solve this problem. I think that's always a great way to move an issue forward, is to say, I'm willing to help, I just need you to help me help contribute back. And that always gets somebody's attention when you offer to help. I think this is just restating what I just said verbally. Things can move fairly slowly. And I think I see people come in, I've seen people come into Drupal and Backdrop that I think just have a hard time with that. They come in and they want to see action in a week, and then they get frustrated and leave. And I don't know if there's a good solution for that, other than trying to help encourage and train them or to be more patient. The difficulty in setting prioritizing and focusing energy. Again, this isn't, these from yesterday, the issue queue, and these numbers, on the one hand, are kind of big, but are probably pitifully small compared to Drupal. But there are 1,800 open issues in the GitHub issue queue. I'm kind of pleased to see that there's more feature requests than bug reports. That surprised me a bit. Although I'm guessing that there's a lot of duplication in the feature requests. But there's just a lot going on, and one of certainly the issues in Drupal has been how do you focus and channel people's energy. And this isn't just a problem like on an abstract level. I hear developers in the Backdrop issue queue like asking for more focus. It's like, what should I be working on? And that's just such a hard problem, because the community, I mean, we do that to some extent, but anytime the community tries to set priorities, that it just doesn't work, because people work on what interests them. Yet, developers want that focus. So there's this tension between sort of wanting to be told what to do, but really not wanting to be told what to do. And again, that problem, obviously apparent in Drupal. It's not something new or specific to Backdrop, but sort of being involved in the planning meetings, like at the core level, and watching developers, contributors come in and say, what are our priorities for this release cycle? And each individual steps forward, well, my priority is this and mine is that, but like, how do you come to any kind of consensus? And there's always there's a fear that if we were to decide, okay, X is the priority, the fear is, are we discouraging somebody who's motivated to work on something else from working on that because we've defined something else as a priority, and that's dangerous. And I think that's ran out of my slides. I don't think I'd like to have, I didn't say, I took longer than I hoped to, which is a good thing. I'd like to just chat about this. So I'm going to turn off the recording, though, because I don't want to try to record our conversation.